Oh, hey guys, how you doing? Yeah, I guess the old zombie apocalypse is just not going to go away anytime real soon. And oh, well, I guess you know what I'm doing with this then. Uh, Fortunately, I think I took care of all the ones that are in the house right now, so we can just talk about Ptahhotep and Maat and the origins of political philosophy. How's that sound today, guys? Okay. Um, let's see. It's a little, oh yeah, it's a little hard to see, but now I feel like I can see everybody better. Um, all right, so please follow along with the PowerPoint entitled Ptahhotep. That's about the best that I can figure how to say this. I am definitely no expert on ancient Egypt, but this seems to be the rough pronunciation, Ptahhotep. So the P is not silent. Okay, so let's get started, shall we? So Ptahhotep was a vizier in ancient Egypt in what is called the Old Kingdom in the 5th dynasty, around it seems around 2300 roughly. You've got some dates on your attachment on the text that I sent you, so you see his exact dates. So he was essentially equivalent to the prime minister in Egypt at this time. Now, it's not a democracy, it's not a parliamentary democracy, but he is the chief minister who was right underneath the pharaoh. Who they weren't actually known as pharaohs at that time, they were still just called kings. So he's right underneath the king, and he is basically the one who's really doing the day-to-day ruling, really is in charge of Egypt, but the king is, of course, technically above him. And so on the slide that you have there before you, the two lower images are ancient depictions, that have come down to us that we believe represent Ptahhotep, who was very famous in his day. Above that, you'll see the image of the goddess Maat. Maat is a concept, not just a goddess, but she was a personification, or she was personified as you see her in this image. She was one of the most important goddesses in ancient Egypt, and like many of the gods and goddesses in Egypt at that time, she takes many different shapes and forms. She's pictured many different ways, and she's often in some kind of animal form, and that's true of most of the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, which is also why there were so many sacred animals, many of which were not to be eaten, because these animals were considered to be personifications of the gods. The gods and goddesses basically represent natural forces or concepts, so Ma'at stands for this wider concept of cosmic harmony, justice, truth. The term actually comes up in the maxims or instructions of Ptahhotep. Our text doesn't actually flag where it is, but when you see the word truth come up, and there's a particular passage that I'll be talking about in just a minute, that's actually where Ma'at is being specifically referenced, but it's just a generally important concept in ancient Egypt. And you could also think of it as being akin to the Tao in classical China. We've already been talking about the Tao as the way of heaven, that kind of principle of cosmic order that Mengzi and Mozi are referring to, and then we're going to see the Tao become really important, or important in a different way with Lao Tzu, which we'll be reading in a few weeks. So this Ma'at is a little similar in that sense. So it means a whole lot of different things, but you can think this general principle of cosmic justice, which is balance, harmony, order. Okay, let's have a look at the next slide. This, just for a little context, this of course is the Great Pyramid in Egypt. And this pyramid, there are various theories about when it actually dates to, but as best we can figure, it dates to roughly 2500 BCE, which is just a little bit before Ptahhotep takes over, becomes the vizier. So basically, you can look at this and think, if you have any ideas of ancient Egypt, really, this is when Egypt is in its kind of heyday. The civilization really begins several hundred years before this. I mean, really takes off just before 3000 BCE. And so it's been going for a long time when Ptahhotep comes into his position of power. And this pyramid has just been built, maybe less than 200 years ago, maybe even barely 100 years before he becomes vizier. So, just you can think about the time of the pyramids as the time of Ptahhotep. This next slide, to 2500 BCE, just to give you a general picture of what we're talking about. There are not a lot of other really kind of advanced civilizations, at least in terms of civilizations that are leaving records, either in writing, hieroglyphics like the Egyptians, or cuneiform writing, as is in Mesopotamia, which you see there on your map. There's a Hittite civilization in Asia Minor, and then there is along the Indus River in South Asia. There is a civilization there. But there's not a lot else. There's certainly not much going on in the areas of Greece that that we talk about in this course. There really is not a lot going on there in terms of civilization. Obviously, there must be humans there, but it's really limited, as you see on the map. There are just not a lot of civilizations leaving records at that time. So Egypt is one of the earliest civilizations, and really crucial, for the record of human history. And Ptahhotep is, as you see on the next slide, well, as I mentioned on the second point. So this is the slide, how far back does philosophy go? On the second point, so Ptahhotep is his instructions, or his maxims, are sometimes called the first book. So why are we taking a look at this text? Why do we take a look at this text in the course? A lot of times Western civilization courses, or political theory courses, intro political theory courses that have this kind of historical arc like ours do, or 2P91 and 2P92 have this kind of historical path where we're doing kind of more ancient stuff and then more modern and contemporary stuff. Really, typically these courses, not just at Brock, but I mean all across Canada and the US certainly, basically they're going to begin with the Greeks. The Greeks, as you've heard me talking about, they're kind of looked back to as the founders of democracy and certain ideas that we take to be foundational for so-called Western civilization. Well, it's interesting then to take a look at texts that are not from that tradition, that in fact go back far further than that tradition, right? So this goes back almost 2,000 years before our text, our Homeric text, and yet they're ever so advanced, right? This civilization was considered by the Greeks themselves, the Greeks in Homer's time and later. They looked back to ancient Egypt. They knew about Egypt. Egypt, of course, existed in their day, but they knew about ancient Egypt and considered that to be a kind of cradle of civilization that they believed that they had learned many things from. And so the Greeks are already looking back at Egypt as a place of wisdom and tradition. They're doing that even in the time that we're looking at with Homer and then down to Plato and Aristotle. But so I think it's important, though, that we try to take a big picture view of what thinking about politics and political philosophy, political theory really is, instead of just being kind of parochial and just looking at, well, this one little area, ancient Greece, as if everything starts from there. It really doesn't all start from there. Sure, there are certain kinds of, this is kind of point 3, I'm skipping around a little bit on this slide. There are certain kinds of particular political philosophizing, in particular the process of dialectic, of kind of question and answer that we see written down in dialogues that come from Socrates and Plato, that we don't see a lot of that before them, at least in Greece. We have question and answer and dialectic going on in those classical Chinese texts, of course, question and answer and elaborations of arguments. But even though we don't have that kind of question and answer, we still are looking at a kind of theorizing and philosophizing that is going on in these instructions from Ptahhotep. Philosophy means, it's a Greek term, but of course it just means the one who is a lover of wisdom. And this text is Ptahhotep's text is absolutely about wisdom. It's about a quest for wisdom. It is about trying to figure out, or well, it's a person who's passing down to his son, who is passing down wisdom about how to live the best life. But the text more generally makes us think about and asks us to question our ideas of what a life really is. What's a good life? What makes a life worth living? And how to have a good life, and how to have a good life in a society with other human beings. So it is absolutely a kind of political philosophizing. So this is why I think it's important that we are looking at texts from outside of Greece, and obviously we have China and those texts, but also texts that predate Greece. Everything doesn't start with Greece. There's lots and lots of interesting thinking and really, complex moral and political theorizing that goes on, thousands of years before Socrates and Plato pop up. Yeah, okay, so I think that's what I want to say from that slide. So let's think about some specific reasons that we can interrogate this text, or that we want to interrogate this text. So it's a source book for the Greeks, right? As I've said, that they look back at the Egyptians. So in a way, it kind of helps us to see these non-Western and even African wisdom traditions and put them alongside the Greeks as kind of equally interesting civilizational texts that reflect on questions of human importance and importance for political thinking. Second reason, so I was already talking about that on the last slide, so that's kind of the first point here on this slide. The second point, the second major point, is that Ptahhotep is interesting because he's coming out of this Mediterranean civilization, which is, it's not the same civilization precisely as the Greeks, but it is roughly the same area. It's this Mediterranean basin. Egypt obviously is on the southern part, Greece is above, but there is a connection between the two. As I'm saying, the Greeks thought themselves indebted to the Egyptians. So there is still some connection there, but what we see is a very different emphasis, because we are seeing, well, it's not just because of this, but we are seeing in these texts from the Egyptians in Ptahhotep, we are seeing a civilization that has been around for a very long time, for almost 1,000 years at the time that Ptahhotep is recording these instructions. It's an agricultural civilization. It is basically stable. This isn't to say that there aren't revolts and that there aren't wars, but there is a kind of continuity there, and you don't have constant strife among warring city-states. And so it's a much more conservative text, and it's a text that focuses much more on balance, order, harmony, and kind of fitting in than what we see with Homer, right? With Homer, it's competition, it's this kind of individualism, this striving, this struggle, this, bloodshed, all in the name of leaving a name for yourself. It's a very different emphasis, and as I say, a kind of a much more conservative emphasis. I don't mean that as a criticism. But it's more about fitting into a place in an already existing society and an already existing political order. And so I think that's interesting, and that's helpful for us to think about as a contrast to the Greeks. Again, we do already have the contrast to the Greeks with Mengzi and Mozi, but this is yet another contrast, but it's an older text, and it's also closer to the Greeks, just in terms of geography. It's not really very far from Egypt to Greece, just across the Mediterranean. So it shows us different possibilities, even within the same area, for how to think about again, what makes a good human life and what makes a good political order. The third kind of smaller reason that I note here on this slide is, I think it's interesting because in some ways, if you take a look at some of the kind of general lessons that I'm distilling here in this third point, there are ways that it's kind of more strangely applicable and useful, even though this text is 4,500 years old or 4,300 years old or whatever it is. More applicable, strangely, in some ways to us, in at least in terms of the way that our society has a certain amount of order and stability. Listen first, be truthful, kind of enjoy your life, live your life, make yourself useful to others, make your wife happy, have children, have a, and be good to your children and be good to those who work for you. It's like these are not crazy ideas, and they're I mean, for today, they fit pretty well with most of what we're taught. So I think that's also sort of interesting to see how, in a way, this world, in some senses, is closer to us than Homer's world. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of the maxims in particular. This is going to be a quick tour here. I'm already at 15 minutes, so I'm gonna try not to go too long, because I know you've already stopped watching. So who am I really talking to at this point? For Ptahhotep, similar though to Homer, aging is a problem. It's mortality that's a problem. That's what that's the kind of problematic that he sets out at the very beginning. Old age sucks. It's destroying his body, and he's kind of reflecting back on what makes a life worth living, and is trying to help his son, and by implication really anyone, trying to help them learn what he has learned over his life. He wants them to listen to him. Listening is so important, as we'll talk about in just a second. And so, but it's in the same way that mortality, the short human life, and death is the problem for the Homeric folks. And then their solution, of course, is, well, usually it's the short life and glory, although Achilles offers the other option of, maybe there is an option for a longer life. But Ptahhotep is also setting out that, death is our common human condition. And so then in light of that, how do we live? So some similarities, at least there with Homer, at least for the setup. So living in accordance with Maat is really what is going to be throughout this. And again, you don't see the term used throughout this text, although truth, when truth comes up, that's Maat. But also when order or harmony or things like that are being referenced in the text, that's also this cosmic principle of balance and order. So it's really, the text is all about how to live in accordance with Maat. How do we live in accordance with kind of the nature of the cosmos? And it's basically find your place in society, which is a part of this larger cosmic order. So find that place and learn how to fit in. So from the very beginning, though, the first lesson is we are all fundamentally ignorant, right? You have to be humble. Even when you think that you are smarter than someone, even when you believe that you are talking with someone who is ignorant, you still have to basically recognize that you don't know everything, and that you are, as a human being, fundamentally limited. And so you should not be arrogant. You should not presume that you know more than you do. And that fundamental disposition to be humble is then going to lead to this injunction to always be listening, because you don't assume that you can just understand everything and you're just going to decide, what kind of life you're going to live. And, I don't like that argument that this person is making. They're stupid. I'm just going to go do this. It's about not trusting yourself too much, and about more like trusting the order of the universe, trusting the system, trusting society. So there's a lot of implicit trust that things are going to work out. So the next slide is when leading or in court, meaning when acting as a leader, because this Ptahhotep assumes that his son is probably going to be doing some, leading, is going to have some importance in society. So he's talking about leadership, but he's also talking about when in court. So the whole section on when you find someone arguing. The idea in Egyptian society at this time, if you're you don't have a lot of politicking going on, because you have a king and the vizier, and then you have the officials who are all ruling in the king's name. But you're going to have a lot of things where you have to go to law courts, where you're trying to say, you've been done an injustice by your landlord or your tenants, or, someone has not paid you. And so, there's a contract that's not being fulfilled. And so there was a lot going on in law courts. So there was a lot of legal contention that was a part of this social order. From the very beginning, Ptahhotep is saying, when you find someone in a court, basically, when you're arguing against someone, if they're your equal, that's the quotation that's there. If they're equal to you, then maybe you're going to argue against them. But the other quotations, the other parts of the text, if it's a superior or if it's an inferior, you basically don't say anything, or you say very little. So again, there is this idea of a hierarchically stratified society, but for you, you can argue or try to correct those who are equal to you, but those who are above you, you defer to, and those who are below you, let them issue their lies and their slanders, and let other people see that you're the calm, wise person who is not going to engage in a kind of, bitter back and forth with those people. So you're basically supposed to look at those. You're only going to sort of jockey with those who are roughly equal to you, but otherwise you're just going to leave it be. So that's in terms of what you're doing in the courts. In terms of leadership, always be gracious is what Ptahhotep is saying. So, you're not supposed to be leading by fear. You're leading by example. You're the kind of, to put it in sort of sports terms, you're the kind of quiet figure in the locker room who leads by working harder than everybody else and doing all of the right things, doing what the coach tells you, right? Because a team is often kind of hierarchically stratified with a coach and then players. So you're doing what you should and leading by example, and that's leadership for Ptahhotep. It's not just boldly going your own way. It's following others who are above you and then showing those who are below you that that's the way to be. And to not worry if you see people who seem to be making money while doing bad things. Maat will take care of them. The order of the universe will take care of them. So just because you see somebody sort of getting ahead, don't contend with them. Don't get upset with them. Things are going to work out in a bad way for them eventually. I guess you could think of it as sort of karma, right? Again, to talk about another more sort of Eastern concept. So karma is going to take care of them. Maat is going to take care of them. Don't you do that. Let them be greedy and do those bad things. I mean, not let them in the sense that, if they're truly breaking the law and you're in charge, then you would probably punish them. But in terms of when you're seeing sort of people who are social equals who may be getting ahead of you, don't make a problem, don't make waves, but know that the universe is kind of going to take care of them. Okay. The next slide, and we're getting close to wrapping up here. So it's really listening that's the primary duty. Now, in this particular translation, this was the only really decent translation I could find that was just easily available online. The word is obey, so it's a splendid thing is obedience of an obedient son. He cometh in and listeneth obediently. It's an old style English translation too. Apologies for that. But where you see obedience in all of these things, obedience is better than all things that are. So you can think it's the kind of listening that leads you to obey. So it's the term is better translated, and I have other translations that translate this as listening or hearing. So it's really listening, hearing, and obeying that kind of all those together are the best thing. That's the primary obligation for a human being. That's how you actually learn to do the thing. It's to be receptive. You're not the one who's always out in front. Even if you're a leader, pushing your opinions or ideas, you're listening, you're receiving, you're kind of taking in what others are giving you or what the universe is sending to you. So listening, hearing, obedience, that's the way to be a good person and the best person. And that's leaders too on the next slide. So, here with this, it's the same term that's being translated differently, but if you're a leader, be gracious when thou hearkenest unto a speech. So when you're listening to a speech. So even the leaders mainly, and there's also some very practical advice here just for when you're in charge of people. If you think about, at your workplace, Ptahhotep is saying, let people just make their complaints, right? Allow them to get their complaints off their chest. Let them speak freely, there's just something useful in that. Even if you can't actually remedy the thing that they want remedy, they feel good being listened to. Good advice even today, let me tell you. And there's also, this is a particular duty for a leader, because he says, if people who are, kind of the common people, aren't willing to actually state what their complaints are, it's probably, this is where he has this, it is said, is it because he, the judge, doeth wrong, that no one entreaties? The implication is, if people aren't willing to actually state their case, there's probably something wrong with the leader, because he is known to not be, of course I'm using he because the leaders at this time would be he's, right? Because this is still a patriarchal, male-dominated society. But so the idea is that the leader, that like, you can tell what's going on with a leader, and if this leader is really good, if people won't actually make their complaints, then you know that there's actually something wrong with that leader, right? Because it shows that people have not felt okay to express themselves before. So again, listening, it's a duty it transcends the social scale. It's all levels of the social scale, that really listening, or being a receiver of what others are putting out, that is kind of your first duty. And again, I've got that quote there. It's not listening exactly, but also making sure that as a leader, that you're making sure that you take care of people who work for you. So be really good with those that you're paying, your hired servants. So again, just because you have more than others, you're not being arrogant, and you're also making sure that you really take care of them as best you can. So it's all about these reciprocal duties that we have to one another, regardless of what your station is. So this next slide, entitled "Not Homer's Glory." So this is really, he talks about what's going to make you remembered, right? So remembrance, just as Homer, or the heroes in Homer, are talking about who gets remembered through the ages, Ptahhotep also is interested in this. He also, because mortality is a problem, because death is a problem, that eternal reputation, or lasting reputation, is also important to him, but it's not through the deeds. And we've had some folks, some students have raised this issue in conversations with me. Why does Homer, or why do the Greeks assume that the way to leave a name to be remembered is through these violent actions? Well, here you see a different notion of what it takes to be remembered. So remembrance and a kind of reputation and glory is also something on Ptahhotep's mind, but it's through these powerful, quiet examples. So, it's the kindly acts that are going to make you remembered. So, give away a lot of your, give lots to people, be gracious, avoid associating with jerks. That's how you're going to get remembered, right? So again, just a very interesting contrast to the scheme of remembrance and what makes a human life worth living in Ptahhotep as opposed to Homer. Okay, so I went a little longer than I intended to, but I'm now wrapping up. So this is a kind of conservative disposition. It's a disposition that says society is basically going to function well when we are all not trying to do too much, when we are all trying to do our job and our role, and we are listening and obeying, rather than all trying to get out and jockey for position and distinguish ourselves in a kind of more selfish, sort of egotistical fashion. This is much like what we will see with later self-identified conservatives like Edmund Burke, who's the kind of font of classical conservatism in England in the late 1700s, and then Michael Oakeshott, a more contemporary version of conservatism. Listen, obey, don't be humble, have a family, have friends, be kind, be an honest person, lead by example, not by being showy, don't make arguments, don't be grasping, don't be greedy. When you're asked to give your opinion, do it truthfully, give your honest opinion. And people are going to like that example, and you will eventually be rewarded. You will eventually be seen by others for the good person that you are. And the universe, it's not just society, but the kind of universe wants this of you. Maat will kind of take care of you. So this is all, this all seems like pretty good advice. The problem is that sometimes there are, zombie apocalypses. And is this also good advice in a zombie apocalypse? Well, it might be, it might not be. I will leave that for you to decide. So take care of yourselves. Ciao.